the story about Saul. Because we find in Acts chapter 9 that Saul met with Jesus on the Damascus road. Or we should better say Jesus met with Saul and changed Saul's life. To the point where Saul, he became known as Paul, and he wrote a third of our New Testament. So what's the lesson for us in this? First is, look, it doesn't matter where you've been. It doesn't matter the mistakes that we made. We can't go back and redo yesterday. Some of us have horribly sordid pasts, just made atrocious mistakes. For some of us, those mistakes were yesterday. But God, when He looks at us, He does not just say, oh, they made all those mistakes, they're done, I can't use them anymore. God takes people who have made horrific mistakes, and He redirects them, and He forgives them, and He sets them on a path to change the world. You know what's interesting about Paul? Check this out. Do you ever notice that your greatest personality strengths are also your greatest personality weaknesses? The things that, the way God made us is both a blessing and a curse. It just depends on which way it's cut. Saul's zeal both had him wreaking havoc on the early church, and then had him bringing the gospel to all of the Roman Empire. That's what the book of Acts, from chapter really 11 forward, you see Paul, that same personality, that same gregariousness, that same zealousness, which had him killing Christians in this chapter and imprisoning Christians in this chapter, has him bringing the gospel to the known world. So if you're sitting here today and you're thinking to yourself, oh, I have just really made a glorious mess of this thing. I'm here to tell you from the example of Paul that very thing that has caused you to make a mess of your life is actually when God can direct those giftings and strength in accordance with His plans. It's exactly why He made you. That's the testimony we have of Paul. That's the testimony we have of Peter too. Remember Peter in the Gospels? Peter always talking, always putting his foot in his mouth. You know, one moment he says something brilliant, he's like, yeah. The next moment he sticks his foot in his mouth. And he's like, oh man, I can't get it right. But then you get to Acts chapter 2, and Peter gets filled with the Holy Spirit. Who's the first person to stand up and proclaim about Jesus? Peter. In Acts chapter 3, when the people draw together after the healing of the man who was crippled, who's the first one to open his mouth and proclaim the glory of Jesus? Peter. Saul was wreaking havoc on the church, but God grabbed him. He forgave him. And He took that same personality and He redirected it forward for His glory. So, brothers and sisters, listen. The way God made you, He wants to direct for His purposes. The giftings you have, the ways that you've made terrible mistakes, listen, that same personality trait, when used for the glory of God, is a force to be reckoned with. And the key for you and I is to not let those giftings that God gave us be an occasion for havoc to be wreaked in people's lives. This isn't the end of the story of Saul. This is just the beginning. He began a mess. He began by hurting people. By the end of his life, He's blessing. And for 2,000 years, people have been reading the letters of this man who wreaked havoc in the church and received huge amounts of spiritual nourishment from